Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse is a movie so positively received by the critics who've already seen it, myself included, that I'm pretty sure the studio is okay with me already telling you that it's good 2 weeks ahead of it coming out, especially since this isn't my review of that movie, which I'll probably end up publishing when it actually comes out. Somewhere. Look, I write for a few different places, alright? It's 2018, the gig economy is what it is. But yeah, it's a film that has no business being as good as it is, considering what it is an animated Marvel spin-off working a multiverse-hopping story gimmick and an ostensible anybody-could-be Spider-Man message about diversity and believing in yourself, mainly to underline a premise that shakes out as the Avengers, but with 6 different Spider-Mans, each sold separately, collect the whole set. But yeah, it works, and one of those alternate take Spider-Man has been so well received that the studio decided they're getting their own spin-off before the first one has even come out. Spider-Gwen, aka Ghost Spider, aka the Spider-Woman of Earth-65, Gwen Stacy. In most Marvel timelines, Peter Parker's tragic doomed girlfriend, but in hers, not that, because she got bit by the spider instead, and Peter is the lizard, and she joins a band, and yeah, anyway,
comics are weird!
But anyway, SpiderGwen, or whatever they decide her costume's name actually is getting her own movie because early screening audiences are responding strongly to a superhero character aimed at teenage girls. What a shock, who could have possibly told them that audience existed, and because it's a venue through which producer Amy Pascal can finally pull off the all-girl team-up movie she's been lobbying Sony and Marvel to make for almost a decade, and for the most part, people seem pretty happy about it. Helpfully, SpiderGwen isn't exactly a newcomer for fans on the hard-to-please comic side of the equation, so there's been plenty of time for people to get used to her. But there's definitely a small contingent that remains somewhat vocally unconvinced, and as the hype train gets rolling for this prospective project, we can now await the spectacle of new fans who first discover that this character even exists from watching Into the Spider-Verse, also known as the vast majority of the planet, find out that not only is there already Spider-Gwen anti-fandom waiting in the wings to grouse about it, a lot of them would say they actually really like Gwen Stacy, they just liked her better when she was dead.
I am really uncomfortable being a girl in this store.
Okay, that might be oversimplifying a little bit, but look, the last of these have run a little long, alright? Less hyperbolically stated, most would tell you that the contention is more closely framed as Gwen Stacy's famous death in the original Spider-Man comics, being not just one of the most significant events in Marvel Universe history, but also a defining moment for the Peter Parker Spider-Man character and the defining moment for the character of Gwen herself, which, yeah, certainly seems like a fairly gross way to think about any character when you say it out loud like that, even if she's not exactly in limited company in terms of women in Western fiction, whose sole important role in their own life stories is to eventually die badly and become motivational corpses, spurring their surviving boyfriends, husbands, whatever, to revenge-fueled heroism, or villainy, or just whatever they were already going to do but will now do with more conviction, and this is not really sounding any better, is it? Shit. I mean, it happens a lot, right? Like, a lot. Hell, it even happened for James Bond in, like, 2 different timelines, and his whole thing is, I don't get attached, that's why I'm so good at seducing henchwomen for information. But he got attached exactly long enough, at least once or twice, for her to die so he could become just a little bit more kick-ass. Here's the thing. For a long time, there was basically only 4 or 5 largely agreed upon actually great Spider-Man stories. You know, ones that were at once good comics, of a historical note in the medium, and noteworthy in the long-term overarching Spider-Man and/or Marvel Universe continuity. The Origin, Kraven's Last Hunt, the Green Goblin discovering his secret identity, and the whole fallout of that, the origin of Venom, and Amazing Spider-Man number 121, the storyline so come-out-of-nowhere shocking in June of 1973 that they didn't even print the title until the final page, The Night Gwen Stacy Died. But it wasn't only the shocker ending that made this such a big deal at the time, it was the way it was made to reverberate throughout the continuing history of the story after that. In effect, it was a soft reboot, a way, intended as such or not, to give the no longer a kid, increasingly written as a grown-up Peter Parker a refreshed origin for the with great power guilt trip aspect of his persona that exchanged the child mourning father figure loss of Uncle Ben with a related but grimmer and more visceral context about possibly having to forego love and companionship because he might get said lovers or companions killed by association.
This is my gift. My curse.
And for about 41 years, Marvel milked the angle of Gwen Stacy's death, pointedly not the specter of the character herself, the fact of her murder, haunting the Spider-Man comics for every drop that it was worth. It's the reason the Green Goblin is Spider-Man's arch-nemesis. It's usually an eventual reason his relationships don't work out. It's the impetus for the original 70s clone story and every dumb thing that ever spun out of that for the next 20 or 30 years. And even when they did do stories where Gwen Stacy was supposed to be more than the ephemeral presence of a dead girl, clone Gwens, fake Gwens, time-displaced Gwens, flashback still alive Gwen, and eventually Spider-Gwen herself as part of the 2014 crossover fan service maxi series from which Into the Spider-Verse took that part of its title, the foundational point that's supposed to make them noteworthy was always that the real or original model was dead. So even alive, the only important or interesting thing about Gwen Stacy for 4 decades was that she was dead and that it was one other thing for Spider-Man to be sad about, a cycle that Spider-Gwen only finally broke by getting her own ongoing series that gave her stories of her own and made dealing with the fact of that on a meta-multiversal level part of her whole running angle. But the thing is, that's not entirely a function of the general crummy way fiction and comics in particular use the dead, usually female loved one trope. as in, it's not as though Gwen Stacy was interesting before she died, she just wasn't. In fact, as written in the original comic, she's probably among the least interesting superhero girlfriends, which is kind of the point. She wasn't sexy to the point of exhaustion like Mary Jane, she wasn't complicated by being related to a villain like Liz Allen, she wasn't dangerous like the Black Cat would eventually be. Gwen Stacy was the nice, normal, stable, largely disconnected from the madness relationship that represented the promise of an ordinary, maybe even happy future and home life that was maybe preferable to almost dying every night being Spider-Man, which yes, made her death all the more shocking and horrible, a complete innocent who dies for literally no other reason than dating someone she didn't even know was Spider-Man, but it also made it that much easier to segue her into being a no longer present character whose absence occasionally makes Peter Parker angry enough to lift heavy things or punch just enough harder. So it's not entirely baffling that a lot of fans who'd spent their Spider-Man reading lives, again, 41 years of this, identifying with Peter and internalizing this view of this character, were initially resistant to the idea of having an unfridged Gwen Stacy suddenly bopping around not only as a recurring character in Spider-Person, but as a version of herself that exists apart from any connection to the 1973 Death of storyline. Inasmuch as it might cheapen or lessen the impact by making Gwen Stacy's death one more impermanent comic book story point that can be just reshaped or undone or rewritten at will, and maybe it does, but maybe it was time for that? A moment ago I referred to Gwen 616's role for the last 4 decades as that of a motivational corpse, which is linguistically reminiscent, at least to me, hence the title, of the phrase exquisite corpse, which refers to a style of collaborative surrealist art popular in the early 1900s where a group of artists would take continuous turns, each adding elements to a drawing or a painting wherever the last turn had left off, invariably ending up with an absurd but kind of compelling hodgepodge. And if you think about it, that pretty handily describes how long-running collaborative continuums like the Marvel Comics universe and the characters within them are put together, managed, and ultimately come to have the kind of weird, wonderful, lumpy, scattershot stories that you can ultimately turn into flights of fancy like Into the Spider-Verse or Thor Ragnarok or Guardians of the Galaxy or Suicide Squad. Okay, it doesn't always work out. New writers take over, once sacrosanct elements get remixed, new things are tried on for size, brought back, discarded, reworked. Hell, did you know that Alfred the Butler was dead for 2 whole years in the 60s and he came back as a villain for a while? Yeah, they did that. Into the Spider-Verse doesn't actually bring up the Death of Gwen storyline at all. At least one of the alternate Peter Parkers who would have presumably had that experience as part of their history in their universe seems to maybe recognize her, but that's about it, and either way, nobody mentions it. It's in no way what defines her here. So for most audiences who only know these characters from movies and have already forgotten that that was the name of Emma Stone's character from the Amazing reboot, or if you, like me, you've actively Eternal Sunshined that whole shit show from your memory, it's highly plausible that the Gwen Stacy who's a spider hero in her own right is going to very quickly become the best known, widely defaulted to version going forward. I think that's okay. Probably more than okay, really. The character is fun, the new fans she's aimed at really seem to be into it, and whatever attachment I might have had to the Haunted Legacy version isn't worth overruling that, or it shouldn't be. Things change, and however meaningful Dead Gwen may have been for a time as a morbid prop, it's hard to argue that in this case, a full-fledged character isn't a change for the better. I'm Bob, and that's the big picture.